Okay, everybody, let's go ahead and get started now. Thank you for joining the webinar. My name is Mark Bollinger, and I am a research scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And I'm joined today by my colleagues and co-authors, Will Gorman and Joe Rand. And together, the three of us will walk you through highlights from a report that we released back in August, which takes a look at the status of operating and proposed hybrid power plants in the US. And this is the fourth year that we've put out this report. The webinar is being recorded, and we will post it to our website shortly after the conclusion of the event. If you do have any questions during the presentation, please type them into Zoom's Q&A feature, and we will do our best to answer them. And finally, I'd like to thank the US Department of Energy's Wind Energy Technologies Office and Solar Energy Technologies Office for co-funding this work. Whoops. So as we get into this, I think you'll see and you will agree that 2022, sorry, I went one slide too much there. 2022 was yet another big year for hybrids in the US, particularly for PV plus storage plants, which had their second big year in a row. And since we are going to cover really all of the content on this slide during the presentation, I'm going to go ahead and skip this slide and launch right into two important policy updates that have come to pass since we issued last year's report in 2022. So the first of these, of course, is the Inflation Reduction Act, which became law in mid-August 2022. The IRA contains many different provisions to support clean power deployment, but perhaps the most important or most relevant change from a hybrid perspective is that for the first time under the IRA, standalone storage now has access to the investment tax credit, or ITC. Prior to the IRA, storage obviously had to be paired with solar in order to access the ITC, but that is no longer the case. And this obviously removes some of the prior impetus to pair batteries with solar. All that said, I can tell you that in this edition of the report, we don't yet see the possible impact of this policy shift on the hybrid market. And that is perhaps for several different reasons. One, the IRA became law relatively late in the year, and it obviously takes the market some time to react and adjust, particularly given the need for implementation guidance from the Treasury, which has been coming out rather slowly in some cases. Similarly, even though the legislation was passed in 2022, the standalone storage ITC did not come into effect until this year, 2023. But in this report, we are focusing primarily on what happened in 2022. Probably the first place that we would see this policy change show up would be the interconnection queues, as that is sort of an early step in the development process. But it turns out that in 2022, queues from some of the bigger regions had either already closed their open application season by the time the IRA was passed, or else in other cases were either actively discouraging or just not accepting new interconnection requests. So we don't see a whole lot of shift in the queue data either, at least not as of the end of 2022, though we'll be looking for that in future years. And then finally, there are several countervailing reasons why hybrids might continue to thrive, even despite the existence of the standalone storage ITC. And we will get into some of those reasons when we run through some case studies a little bit later. So the second major policy update is FERC Order 2023, which came down just a few months ago, so it's a relatively recent thing. This order requires transmission providers to allow multiple resources to co-locate on a shared site behind a single point of interconnection, and also to share an interconnection request. It also allows interconnection customers to add additional resources to existing interconnection requests under certain circumstances without having to go to the back of the line and sort of restart the queue study process. And both of these provisions, of course, could favor hybridization by allowing generators to kind of make better use of their existing sites and their existing queue positions. Since this order is only a few months old, it's still too early to gauge the impact. And I thought I should also mention that some regions out there are already following these particular practices. So we've got these two major policy updates, perhaps moving in somewhat opposite directions in terms of their impact on the hybrid market, but in both cases, it's a little early to tell the net impact on the market. Okay, as in past years, we've broken the presentation up into 3 different segments. In a minute here, I'll hand it over to Will to talk about operational hybrid plants that were online as of the end of 2022. I'll come in kind of towards the end of that segment to run through a case study or two before talking a little more about PPA terms from a sample of PV plus battery plants that we've collected. And then finally, I'll hand it over to Joe to tell us what's coming through the pipeline in terms of hybrids within interconnection queues. Advanced too far there.
No worries. I can, oh, you got one more. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say a little bit about the scope here. So when we talk about hybrids, we're using a pretty expansive definition of what qualifies as a hybrid. We're including both co-located and full hybrid plants. Co-located plants are those where you've got multiple resources sharing an interconnection queue or point of interconnection, but perhaps kind of operating independently from one another. And then the full hybrid model is something that includes both the co-location and also co-control, where the individual components are operated in more of a coordinated fashion. We exclude virtual hybrids because they violate the co-location requirement. And also, for the most part, we're looking at utility scale plants and ignoring smaller plants that are often behind the meter and that don't necessarily show up in our data sources. So with that clarification on scope, let me just hand it over to Will to talk about the operational fleet.
Great. Thanks, Mark. And thank you all for joining us today, as Mark said, for, I think, our 4th iteration of this report. So for the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we found in regards to operational hybrid plants, again, that came online by the end of 2022. So of course, the last 9 months, development has happened. That's not going to be covered on this in this presentation. Okay, so as we have done in past years, see if I can get the slides to advance. Joe, it's hanging up a little bit for me, so I'm wondering if it might just be, yeah. Appreciate it. I might tell you to advance it. So just real quickly, run down the methods and data sources here. Nothing really has changed for those of you who have tracked this report over the past few years. All of our operational data comes from EIA 860's early release report, as well as some review and collating of public announcements. So that means that for the most part, what I'm talking about here are generators with a combined capacity greater than 1 megawatt, and some limited spot checking of that EIA data. The way we identify these hybrids is either they have the same EIA ID, which makes it quite easy to find and mark them as a hybrid. But in some cases, we've also reviewed some FERC regulatory filings and trade press articles that allow us to augment our hybrid sample by projects that we haven't been able to connect via EIA ID. So again, like this Mark says, this suggests co-location of generators at one point of interconnection, but it does not suggest co-controlled generators. And we'll have a slide on that particular attribute a little bit later when we talk about some of the fleet in California and CAISO. And then Mark also mentioned the virtual hybrids are excluded here. Some of the challenges and limitations that help you contextualize the data that I'm about to show you is that even though we are not focused and we are not trying to collect behind the meter or microgrid resources, there are some projects that are microgrids that are larger than 1 megawatt. And those will show up here, but they're a pretty small portion of the sample because of our focus on pretty large resources. And then maybe the last thing I'll say, the last bullet on this slide is that we exclude dual fuel and CSP units. as those use the same prime mover technology, so steam turbines, even though they have the capability to change fuels. We're not focused on that. That would expand the sample a lot and be a little bit messy. We're really focused on technologies with different primary drivers here. Could you go to the next slide? Great. So let's talk a little bit about the data. There's obviously a lot of numbers here. This is a big table, and it's mainly meant to convey that there are lots of different configurations of hybrid and co-located plants that were operational at the end of 2022 and that we identify in using our methods. But I think if there's one thing that this slide will point out, and which will be a trend of the next 10 minutes of me talking, is that it really is dominated by the PV plus storage plant type. People talk a lot about hybrids in the abstract, using just the hybrid terminology. And admittedly, there are other types here. There's a few wind plus storage plants. There's fossil plus storage. You see fossil plus PV. But by far the most popular plant is the PV plus storage type. But across the whole scale of this space, we found 374 plants, representing almost 41 gigawatts of capacity, generating capacity, with 5 gigawatts of storage capacity. That is in total 15 gigawatt hours of storage energy. So it is a pretty substantial amount of capacity that's on the US system in this particular type of plant configuration. So let's hone in a little bit on some of the more popular, or I would say more recently popular, at least, projects. And so those are these 5 categories here. And so now what we're seeing in this bar graph is a breakdown of that capacity between the generating fuel type and the storage type. And so I think on this slide, you see in particular, this fossil plus storage category jumps out a little bit more than you see in the table, even though PV plus storage has almost 10 times as many plants. The projects that are combining fossil technologies with storage do pair a pretty sizable fossil plant with some amount of storage, and you see that kind of pop out as the second largest category here. Some of the metrics on the right-hand side of the graph are interesting as a point of comparison. They all relate to different parts of the storage size. So this first metric compares the storage capacity to the generating capacity. And you see how that is largest for the PV plus storage category. You can also see the total amount of storage energy that is paired to these different generators, as well as the average duration of the storage, with, again, PV plus storage dominating in all 3 of these types, but with decent durations of batteries on the fossil plus storage and the wind plus PV plus storage project sample. So this is actually a new slide that we added this year to really hone in on this point about growth and where this hybrid sector is dynamic. And what we show here is, especially if you look over the last 3 years, the last 4 years, there's really only 2 categories of the many categories that I showed a few slides earlier that are seeing substantial additions. So that's, of course, PV plus storage, what we've been talking about, but also this fossil plus storage category. You see some upticks and some changes in some of these other categories, but really those other categories are just showing technologies that have been paired for a long time that really are not changing. And I think that's an important contextual point to make when people are talking about hybrids. They're really talking about a certain amount of the categories here. Let's go to the next slide. So I talked a little bit about metrics regarding the storage to generation ratio, as well as the storage duration. I repeat those on these two charts. So that's the blue diamonds that was shown on slide 9. But now I'm also giving you a little bit of flavor for the distribution of these two metrics across the fleet that we've identified. And so we saw earlier that when it comes to PV storage to generation ratio, this is the left-hand graph, that PV plus storage had the largest ratio, and that holds even when looking at the full distribution of plants that we have compiled. Turning to the right, an interesting addition on this slide is that we've added in standalone storage to this metric. And so while you see that amongst the hybrid types, the popular hybrid types, which are fossil plus storage, PV plus storage, and wind plus storage, you see that PV plus storage has that higher duration, as we talked about earlier. But when you compare it to standalone storage, it has a pretty similar distribution. So you're seeing similar durations in the standalone market as you're seeing for the storage that is getting paired with a PV plant. So let's dive in a little bit deeper to that comparison between standalone storage capacity and hybrid storage capacity. And so on this chart, or these two charts, what I'm showing are the cumulative storage capacity in gigawatts, and that's on the top. And then on the bottom, it's the cumulative storage energy in gigawatt hours. And through 2022, we found that PV plus storage plants include about equivalent amounts of storage capacity, roughly 4 gigawatts, as standalone storage plants. But importantly, this is a slight change from last year, as there was a larger jump in standalone storage capacity in 2022 than we saw for the PV plus storage type. In terms of energy amounts, there was roughly 2,000 megawatt hours more storage energy in that PV plus storage type as compared to standalone storage. But last year, PV plus storage hybrids had almost double the cumulative energy capacity. And so what we're seeing with both of these metrics is that standalone storage is starting, at least as of last year, to shrink that gap in some of the total installed capacity amounts of storage that we're tracking. And so now it's useful to ask the question, so what are these batteries being used for, and how do they compare in the hybrid configuration as compared to the standalone configuration? So on this chart, we show self-reported use cases broken up by energy arbitrage, grid services, so think about ancillary services, grid balancing, things like that, renewable firming and curtailment, that's in green, peak shaving, and then backup power. And so on this chart, you see that grid services, as they were last year, remain the most reported use case, though you do see renewable firming being a particularly important use case, especially when it comes to PV plus storage. We found that backup power and arbitrage are the least popular use cases reported by operators. And again, this is for the entire fleet, so batteries that came online 10 years ago, as well as batteries that came online last year. And so because of that last point, and because of maybe some of the anecdotes that you've started to hear in the industry about arbitrage becoming more and more important, we wanted to add an analysis of how this use case has been changing over time. And I think that arbitrage storyline comes through a little bit more clearly on this slide than it did on the past. And so what you can see here is that when looking at the percentage of installed capacity and how use cases have changed over time, you see over that last 3 years that arbitrage has really ticked up and become a more important use case for these battery technologies. Though grid services, which is the top line, this brown line, though it hasn't changed much as a percent of installed capacity, it still remains the top use case being reported. And just a quick note here, because you might be a little confused, these numbers can add up to more than 100%, as these batteries oftentimes do report multiple use cases when they are being installed. and just saw a Q&A chat pop up on this. So this bottom sentence explains what grid services involve. So frequency regulation, load following, ramping spinning reserves, load management, or voltage or reactive power support. All right, so in the next few slides, we're just going to talk a little bit more about the geospatial variety of these installations. I don't want to spend too much time here. This is quite a busy graphic, but it gives you a little bit of flavor of all of the different technologies. Again, we're tracking in all of the different locations that they appear. Similar to last year, we are still finding that Massachusetts contains the largest number of PV hybrid plants, but all of those plants have less than 7 megawatts of PV. And that can be compared to California, which has the second highest number at 52 plants, of which half have PV capacities greater than 100 megawatts. So it is important not just to look at the total number of installations, but really the total capacities that are being installed. I'll talk a little bit about wind hybrids later, but we'll make one last point about fossil hybrids, that California also sees the majority, basically half of all fossil plus storage hybrids across the country at 9 total plants, whereas the next closest state only has 2. All right, so we can now start to aggregate that prior slide into important regions. Here we're doing it based on ISO and non-ISO regions. On the left side, I'm focusing on aggregate generator capacity by hybrid type. And then on the right side, we're looking at aggregate storage capacity by plant type and ISO again. Now there's 4 charts on the right because when looking at storage capacity, we can also look at standalone storage capacity. So I think the thing that pops out immediately here, which maybe would be intuitive based on what I was just saying on the prior slide, is that across all 4 plant types in regards to aggregate storage capacity, CAISO, so the California ISO, has roughly equal amounts of storage capacity as all other regions combined, but more than double the storage energy. So it has way more storage capacity than any one individual region, but that is an order of a magnitude different when you're looking at the total energy amount. And so we really see CAISO dominating in this category, both for hybrid storage capacity and standalone storage capacity. All right, so now I'm going to jump into 2 graphs that just drill into wind hybrids in particular and solar hybrids, and then I'll be turning it back over to Mark. So I mentioned that I would spend a little bit more time on wind, but the reason we haven't talked so much about it is that there was only one new plant that we found in our tracking processes that brought a wind hybrid online, and that was the Wheat Ridge wind plus solar plus storage plant, which is a very large plant that came online, but it was the only new wind hybrid. And you can see that in the chart on the right, the cumulative capacity of different components of these wind hybrids over time. There's been a steadily increasing trickle of these projects, but nothing as substantial as what we see on the next slide, which, see if this will move forward. Joe, you might need to hit it again for me.
Just do this.
See if I can get it to go. Sorry for a little bit of the technical difficulties. I think there might be a little bit of an internet challenge. Okay.
Well,
here we go.
The head quite a bit. Do you want me to go back?
Oh yeah, can you go to the PV plus storage? I think I'm seeing a little bit of a delay compared to what you are seeing.
Okay, it's on the PV plus storage now.
Okay, Great. So here, as compared to so I guess maybe I should confirm is okay, now it is back. Okay, it's back. I'm a little bit delayed. So okay, real quickly, this is my last slide. This is the PV hybrids that are split up across geographic regions. You can see a little bit more clearly the storyline around Massachusetts, a lot of green up there. Those are all relatively small projects, and then much larger projects in California. And then I think this chart on the right is very pertinent as it compares to that wind hybrid chart that you just saw, where that wind and storage cumulative capacity have really taken a jump up in recent years when it comes to this hybrid capacity. And so with that, I will stop and turn it over to Mark.
Okay, thanks, Will. Yeah, okay, so good. We're on the right slide here. So, because PV plus storage dominates the operational fleet, we do like to drill down a little bit more into that particular segment and try to take a look at some of the various aspects of how these plants are configured and how they operate. So in terms of configuration, there are basically two choices. There's AC coupling versus DC coupling. AC coupling in the top left basically means that the solar array and the battery are interconnected or coupled with each other on the AC side of the inverter, which in turn means that each individual component, both the solar array and the battery, requires its own inverter. With DC coupling, the two resources are connected on the DC side of the inverter, which means they can get by sharing a single inverter. Though in this case, you need one additional piece of equipment, which is a DC to DC converter, so that the solar array can charge the battery directly. Each of these approaches has pros and cons, and I don't think it's really possible to say that one is necessarily superior to the other. So one of the things we like to do is look at the prevalence of DC versus AC coupling in the market. So in this case, what we did is we looked at 53 of the largest operating PV plus storage plants. These are all plants that have greater than 5 megawatts of PV capacity. And so even though they only make up about a quarter of the total fleet of operating PV plus storage plants, they account for the vast majority of PV capacity, and storage energy. And it turns out that 41 of these 53 plants are AC coupled and just 12 are DC coupled. So it's a pretty big imbalance in favor of AC coupling, though I think it's also important to keep in mind that 17 of these 53 plants are battery retrofits. So in other words, the battery was added later to an existing PV plant, and retrofit applications almost universally favor AC coupling for logistical reasons. So if we exclude those 17 retrofits and focus just on the 36 greenfield plants in this sample, we find that 25 are AC coupled and 11 are DC coupled. So still an imbalance in favor of AC coupling, but it's not quite as large as it is at first glance. A second notable aspect that we think about and look at is how these resources kind of operate in the market or how they participate in the market. And I saw a few questions come in about this, about how planners and ISOs and RTOs sort of model and think about the performance of these hybrid assets. And I guess in response to those questions, there's a lot of the rules and regs surrounding hybrids are still sort of being worked out in these various markets, and different markets are taking different approaches. In CAISO, there are basically two participation models that hybrids can pursue. They can pursue a co-located model where each of the components sort of offers into the market separately, independently, and they're dispatched that way as well. And then there's also a second model, the hybrid model, where the entire plant sort of offers into the market as a single unit. And CAISO puts out some data on the prevalence of these two approaches. And although both are in use, there's sort of a clear preference for the co-located model. And that happens to jive with the results of some recent modeling work that a few of our colleagues participated in. They recently put out a report that I've linked here in the bottom portion of this slide. So maybe in response to those few questions that we saw come in, I think that report linked there would probably be pretty helpful in responding. All right, so now I just want to quickly turn to one of the case studies that we included this year. This is the Desert Sunlight plant in California. It is a 550 megawatt PV plant that first came online in 2014, or at least the PV component came online in that year. Roughly 8 years later, the plant owner added a sizable battery. It's a 230 megawatt, 4-hour duration battery. And as you can see down in the bottom left here, they were able to tuck that battery, which is called Desert Sunlight Storage 1, into kind of the corner of the existing PV plant footprint. So it's right there just south of the existing solar substation. If all goes well in 2024, they will add a second identically sized battery in that same general area, just north of the substation, and once again falling within the existing plant footprint. And so there are really kind of two elements of this that jumped out at us. One is this ability to kind of tuck the batteries into the existing footprint and not require any extra land. Similarly, because these batteries will operate within the confines of the original 550 megawatt interconnection agreement, there's really no need for them to kind of go through the full interconnection queue study processes, which means that the sponsor is able to move relatively quickly here, progressing from PPA approval to commercial operation in under a year. And so these are some of those countervailing influences that I mentioned earlier as to why hybrid activity might continue going forward, even in spite of the existence of the standalone storage ITC. We also looked at the impact of the battery on the capacity credit and capacity value of this particular plant. As many of you are probably aware, the capacity credit or capacity contribution or resource adequacy contribution of solar tends to decline as more and more solar is added to the grid. So as solar market penetration increases, solar's capacity credit declines. And we can see that here in these dashed lines in the bottom left graph. They show the capacity credit or net qualifying capacity of the solar portion of the plant. So back when it first came online in 2016, you can see it was up around 400 megawatts during the summer months. But over time, that capacity credit has diminished to the point where in 2023, if the plant had not added a battery, it would look like this really thick green line here down at the bottom, which is pretty negligible in terms of capacity credit. But of course, the plant did add a battery, which boosted its capacity credit up to that thick orange line there with the first battery. And once the second battery comes online, it'll resemble this thick blue line up top, which is much closer to the plant's nameplate capacity. And then over on the right, all we did is just multiply these net qualifying capacity numbers from the left graph by representative capacity prices to get a sense for how much the capacity value of the plant increased as a result of adding the battery. And what you can see here is that once the second battery comes online, it will result in roughly a $50 million per year boost in capacity value over what the PV plant alone would have otherwise experienced. We also, for this same plant, we took a look at the impact of the battery on effective land use intensity from a resource adequacy perspective. But in the interest of time, I think I'm going to skip over this one, and we can potentially come back to it during Q&A if there's interest. But I wanted to make sure we had a little bit of time for the second case study, where we looked at a pretty significant repowering down in Kramer Junction, California, which for many years was home to the Solar Energy Generating Systems, or SEGS 3 through 7 plants. These were five parabolic trough concentrating solar thermal power plants that were built back in the mid to late 80s, which makes them among the first and also oldest utility scale solar plants in the world. These plants operated for many years and were gradually decommissioned from 2018 through 2021. Following the decommissioning, the plant owner or the site owner basically repowered the site with a PV plus storage plant, which it aptly named Resurgence Solar. So Resurgence Solar is 138 megawatts of PV plus 115 megawatts of 4-hour storage. And that repowering has brought a number of benefits. First, you can see in the graph in the bottom left, the repowered PV plus storage plant is expected to generate significantly more energy in pretty much every month, more so than the existing SEG CSP plants. So there's more energy, and it's also cheaper energy. Resurgence is selling its output through 20-year PPAs at a levelized price of about $45 per megawatt hour, which includes both the PV and the battery component. And that is much cheaper than the $126 per megawatt hour average price that the SEGS plants were receiving in the years before their decommissioning. And then finally, down in the bottom right, once again, we can see the impact of the repowering on the capacity credit or the resource adequacy credit of the site. So the dashed lines show the erosion and capacity credit for the CSP plants, and the thick black line shows the capacity credit enhancement as a result of having the battery on site. So sticking with PV and PV plus storage, let's look, take a kind of a quick look at a sample of, PPAs that we've collected across 10 states. The sample is actually dominated by plants in just 4 states, California, Nevada, New Mexico, and Hawaii. And about half of the sample are PPAs for plants that are already operational, and the other half are still under development or construction. Okay, here's what the time series of levelized PPA prices looks like. So each of these bubbles represents the levelized price from a single contract. It includes both the storage and the PV component. And all 3 graphs here convey the same information, the only exception being what the bubble size represents. So let's focus on the kind of the lower right graph here and ignore the other 2. And what you see is that Hawaii, which is shown here in orange, is clearly priced at a premium over plants that are on the mainland. And Hawaii also has more of a kind of a downward price trend than we see on the mainland, where the trend is pretty flat. And both of those things could be partly due to what the bubble size represents in this case, which is the storage ratio or the battery to PV capacity ratio. In Hawaii, it's pretty much universally set at 100%. So in other words, the battery is sized at parity with the PV capacity. And that is so that the battery can be guaranteed to be large enough to absorb the full output of the plant during peak midday output when Hawaii's grid is most likely to be saturated with rooftop solar. And, you know, a larger storage ratio means a larger battery, and that of course adds cost, which could be one of the factors behind this premium. And that could also be why we see more of a flatter time trend on the mainland, shown in blue, because if you kind of squint there, you can see that storage ratio has been increasing over time. And again, a bigger battery is going to bump up your costs a little bit there. There are a subset of these PPAs that break out the PV pricing from the storage pricing, which allows us to kind of look at the premium that adding a battery to your standalone PV plant incurs. We call that the levelized storage adder, and here we're showing it 4 different ways. So in the upper left, we're showing the data in dollars per megawatt month terms, which is typically how we see it come through in the contracts. The storage component is often priced as sort of a tolling agreement or resource adequacy agreement in dollars per megawatt month terms. And you can see that, you know, after enjoying a kind of a declining price curve for a number of years, the trend line has sort of turned around and moved upwards recently, which is consistent with what we've heard in the trade press about supply chain issues and inflationary pressures. Over on the right, we convert this to dollars per megawatt hour stored. That graph looks pretty much identical. The only difference is what the numbers on the y-axis represent. If we go down to the bottom left, that graph there transforms the data into dollars per megawatt PV terms. And this is how you'd want to think about this if you're trying to answer the question, by how much will my standalone PV PPA price increase if I add a battery? And the answer, at least based on this graph, seems to be anywhere between $10 and $15 per megawatt hour, which in turn depends on what we see in the bottom right graph, which again is this storage ratio. So in this case, the x-axis is not time, it's the storage ratio or the battery to PV capacity ratio. And you can see there's a pretty nice linear trend there where the larger the battery, the higher the storage adder. So with that, let me turn it over to Joe, and he will tell us what's coming through the queues.
Great. Thanks a lot, Mark. So in the next set of slides, I'll be focusing more on the longer term development pipeline for hybrid plants. So these are drawn from transmission interconnection queues from grid operators across the country. Now, those of you familiar with LBNL's interconnection queue analysis might see some familiar slides here, but there are some new and interesting insights in particular to hybrid power plants in the next set of slides. If you're not familiar with interconnection queues, basically these data represent the set of power plants that have submitted requests to connect to the electric grid, but are not yet built. So these are plants that are undergoing a series of interconnection studies to understand the impact of injecting new capacity in the grid and to establish what upgrades would be needed to connect those plants to the grid. Now, we collected these data from all 7 of the ISO RTOs across the US, as well as a bunch of non-ISO utilities that are shown on this map. The data here really only include projects that are connecting to the transmission or bulk power system. So we're not looking at behind the meter or kind of distribution connected projects here. And just to be clear, as with the other slides you've seen today, this represents a snapshot as of the end of 2022. I will say in some cases for the data that we get from these interconnection queues, the data can be imperfect or incomplete for hybrid power plant details. So we make the best effort we can to collect all the information on hybrids, but in some cases, for example, the storage capacity might not be provided. So we sometimes estimate that storage capacity component in these hybrid plants. This slide shows the total capacity in gigawatts in the queues over time, broken out by generator type. You'll note that the total height of each bar represents the full cumulative capacity in the queues as of that year. So this is not just kind of the additional or annual capacity entering, this is a full cumulative capacity. And the hatched portion on each bar represents the capacity in hybrid configuration. Looks like my slides just went a little crazy here, so I'll try to get back here. In general, what's pretty clear here is we see really extraordinary growth of solar and storage in the queues. In particular, we see that growth really strong in hybrid capacity of those resources. I should note we only started really making the hybrid storage estimate beginning in 2020, so you'll see a little bit of a discontinuity in the storage portion of that slide. Now, out of the 10,000 or so power plants that we find currently active in the interconnection queues, we identified about 2,300 hybrid power plants. Notably, over 90% of those are for solar plus battery plants. So same story we saw in the previous slides where solar plus storage really dominates not only the existing hybrid plants, but also the pipeline. Year-over-year growth, I want to reemphasize here in proposed hybrids is pretty remarkable. So hybrid capacity that we see in the queues as of the end of 2022 was about 59% higher than what we saw at the end of 2021. Now in this slide, the figure on the left illustrates the proportion of the total queue capacity that's in hybrid configuration for these various generator types. And what you can see is about 48% of all solar capacity in the interconnection queues is proposed in a hybrid configuration. And that compares with just about 8% of wind capacity in the queues. Looking at the storage bar, you can see roughly half of all the storage capacity in the queues is paired with some form of generation. And on the right-hand side here, you can see the year-over-year growth in proposed hybrids from 2020 to 2022, again, showing a pretty clear growth trajectory here. Now, it's important to note there are pretty substantial regional differences in these proposed hybrid power plants. So, for example, when we look at solar hybrids, they are pretty widespread. You see a substantial amount of solar hybrids in all the grid operating regions that we study, but they're highest in California ISO and the non-ISO West. So particularly in California, practically all of the solar capacity in the interconnection queue is paired with storage. Just as another example, looking at the gas column, we see overall, very little, a small percentage of gas capacity is in a hybrid configuration. And of those gas hybrids, the vast majority is in the non-ISO West. Now here again, we're looking at regional differences and distributions of three power plant types that we see in the queues: wind plus storage on the left, solar plus storage in the middle, and just standalone storage on the right. And again, it's really clear that solar plus storage is, by far the dominant in terms of proposed, total proposed capacity. And in general, we see strongest interest in the non-ISO West and in California, but other regions like PJM, ERCOT, and MISO are really growing in terms of that development pipeline for both solar plus storage and standalone storage. Now, the queue data also give us some indication of when these proposed projects might actually come online, if they were to do so, although I should note that the vast majority of projects in the queue ultimately withdraw. Just as an example, we saw about 70% of the hybrid capacity in the queues has proposed to come online by the end of 2025. In the bottom figure, we broke down all this hybrid capacity by their interconnection study status. So you can see those colors are broken down by kind of the initial interconnection status, like the feasibility study, mid-stage might be the system impact study, and then kind of the later stage would be an interconnection agreement that's been signed and executed. Now, those projects with executed interconnection agreements are certainly much more likely to come online, although they still might experience substantial delays with supply chains and local permitting and the like. But overall, we saw about 12% of this hybrid capacity already has a signed interconnection agreement, and that represents 56 gigawatts of solar plus battery plants that have an executed agreement to connect to the grid. We also examined the ratio of storage to generation capacity in these proposed plants. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here for the sake of time, but I will note that overall we see a slightly higher storage to generator capacity ratio for wind plus storage plants at about 100% in the median case than we do for solar plus storage plants at about 88% in the median case, although I will note that sample of wind projects is rather small here. What I think is maybe more interesting as a takeaway from this slide is that these proposed storage to generator ratios that we see in the queues are higher than those of existing projects of the same type. So the median ratios for existing projects are shown here as red diamonds on this slide. And you can see in most cases, the median proposed power plants have a higher ratio. And then for my last slide on the interconnection queues, again, I'll just move quickly through this one. For the California ISO, we were able to compare the total proposed hybrid capacity to the capacity limit at the point of interconnection, or the POI limit. So that's the maximum capacity that the project can export to the grid at any given moment. And the key takeaway here is that in general, we see that POI limit is roughly the same as the generator capacity alone for most power plants. So this suggests that these power plants in the queue plan to maximize their interconnection limit by really just using the storage to supply power only at times when the solar or wind plant is not generating at full capacity. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Mark to just give us a few conclusions before we turn to Q&A.
All right, thanks, Joe. So hopefully you all got the message that 2022 was, again, yet another big year for hybrid plants in the US, and in particular for PV plus storage. As Will mentioned, at the end of the year, there were more batteries operating as part of a hybrid plant than there were on a standalone basis. Though, of course, it'll be interesting to see how much longer we can continue to make that statement, given the policy shifts that we talked about earlier, namely the IRA standalone ITC, perhaps being counterbalanced somewhat by FERC Order 2023. So in the interest of time, I don't think we need to run through these conclusions. Let's just turn right to Q&A. And maybe Will has a question or two queued up already.
Yeah, I can kick us off with a question. And I'm going to try to combine a few of these all in once. And so the first one I think I want to ask, which, Mark, you can feel free to deny or not, but there are a few questions about what's happening in 2023. So there was a question of someone saying, I'm starved for LCOE data in 2023, given the changes that now that we're a little bit post-pandemic and the supply chain issues. There was a similar comment, I think, from Paul about the lithium carbonate price spike subsequently declining. And so wondering if, there's any sneak peek you can get to maybe what we're seeing in the costs of some of these technologies in 2023, which of course, you'll have to wait for the final version until next year's report.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a whole lot of data on what's going on in 2023 so far. I do try to stay on top of PPAs that become publicized and perhaps with some data disclosed as well, but that is kind of few and far between these days. And so I don't have a whole lot of visibility into what's happening in 2023 at this point. So yeah, I think I have to wait for next year's report.
That's right, yeah. I'll ask another one, and I think this could be answered by any of us, but maybe I'll let one of you take the first pass. There were a few questions about why we are seeing a lack of wind hybrid development as compared to some of the other resources, or if we have any theories behind why solar is being paired more often, with storage, or I guess why we're not seeing maybe solar plus wind as much either. And so any theories or comments that you two want to make?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. So for wind, wind plants typically take the PTC and that's more advantageous than the ITC. And up until the IRA was passed, I don't think they could even access the ITC. Whereas storage, prior to the IRA, was only able to access the ITC if it were paired with solar. And so this is primarily a function of just the policy incentives available to the various resources. It's also the case that, solar has this nice diurnal production profile, which really lends itself to kind of a single cycle of the battery per day. Whereas with wind, that's not necessarily the case, because it can kind of blow, the wind can blow at various times throughout the day, which makes the argument for pairing with batteries a little bit more convoluted.
Great. Yeah, no, I don't have much more to add beyond what Mark said. So maybe I'll pose another question here. Again, this one might be more for Mark, but we can all maybe feel free to jump in. So Joshua had a question about Sunlight Storage 1, one of the case studies, being an outlier a little bit on how quickly it was interconnecting, and wondering if we have seen any other similar success stories like this in CAISO or maybe in other places, and whether we have any more information about whether other queued projects share similar timelines, which may be something that Joe can take. So let's start there. That was the first half of the question about these interconnection queue timelines.
Yeah, I don't know. Joe, do you want to take that one? I mean, I could say a little bit about sunlight storage as potentially being an outlier. You know, that is certainly potentially the case. I know in California they were trying to kind of fast track some of the battery projects as a way to kind of make sure they can meet their resource adequacy needs in some of the tight summer months. And so there may have been a little fast tracking going on there. But I guess the other thing I'll say is that under FERC Order 2023, FERC is trying to encourage this sort of fast track approach where developers can kind of tack these batteries onto their existing sites and hopefully not have to go through a full-blown queue process and thereby move from kind of development to commercial operation in a much shorter timeline.
Yeah, exactly, Mark. So I do think the changes in Order 2023 are going to be important here. And I think in some of the ISOs, we were already seeing some of those rules established, where, for example, you know, an existing queue request or you know, queue position could add battery storage into that same request if it was, you know, not deemed a material modification. In other words, yeah, if it used that same kind of POI limit and met kind of other conditions. So that is a way I think that, you know, we could see either retrofit, you know, hybrid plants where we're just tacking storage onto existing PV. That was the case with sunlight storage here. Or with projects that haven't been built yet, but already have a queue position for a standalone solar plant that are, you know, subsequently wanting to add storage. So I think that's an important opportunity. But yeah, I mean, overall, the question, you know, Joshua is totally right that we're seeing some really, really long timelines in the interconnection queue process, even in California. And in fact, in California, we saw some of those timelines driven after an interconnection agreement was signed, where we're seeing kind of just really long durations to go for those kind of final permitting and construction and supply chain issues to all line up.
And, the only thing I'll add here is just so I can answer the second half of this question about utility IRPs, and that is just to say that is definitely partly driving this growth. You know, Joe showed a map of solar plus storage actually having the most number of generating capacity gigawatts in the non-ISO West, which we would think is more driven by individual utility IRPs. So that's definitely a storyline here driving some of that growth. So I don't know. I think we're at the top of the hour, and I think to respect everyone's time, we probably want to close the show down here. I know we didn't get to all of the questions that are still open, and we try to do our best to follow up with the individual question askers afterwards. But I don't know if Mark, you want to say anything else to close us out.
Not necessarily. Just want to thank everybody for sticking with us and apologize for some of the technical challenges we had this time around. So thanks everybody, and have a great day. And thanks Will and Joe as well.
Thanks all for joining.